Late at night, Letherbo walked home after a long, tiring shift at the small restaurant where she worked. The quiet town of Zubayn was almost completely silent, with only the distant barking of a stray dog breaking the eerie stillness. The streetlights flickered weakly, casting long, dancing shadows on the empty road. She pulled her thin jacket tighter around her, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling creeping over her. The night air felt heavier than usual, pressing down on her like an invisible weight. As she walked, the sound of her own footsteps echoed in the silence. Then, out of nowhere, she heard another set of footsteps behind her, slow, measured, deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat. She glanced over her shoulder, but the street was empty. Maybe she was imagining it. Maybe it was just her mind playing tricks on her after a long day. She quickened her pace, hoping to reach home faster. But the footsteps behind her did the same, matching her speed. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She wasn't imagining it. Someone was following her. Her hands trembled as she clutched her bag tightly, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. The road ahead stretched into darkness, and her small home felt miles away. She wanted to run, but fear kept her legs stiff, locking her in place. She turned into a narrow alley, hoping to lose whoever was behind her. For a brief moment, everything went silent. She stopped, straining her ears. Maybe whoever it was had gone the other way. Maybe she was safe. But just as she was about to take another step, the footsteps rushed forward, fast and aggressive. Terror exploded inside her. Someone was coming for her. Letherbo's breath came quicker as she picked up her pace. The uneasy feeling in her chest tightened like a fist around her heart. The footsteps behind her didn't fade away. Instead, they followed, steady, relentless, and in perfect rhythm with hers. It was as if whoever was behind her was waiting for the right moment to strike. A cold wave of fear spread through her body, making her hands tremble as she clutched her bag tighter. She wanted to turn around to see who it was, but something inside her screamed, "Don't look back, just keep moving." The streets of Zubayn were empty, not a single soul in sight. Normally, there would be a few people sitting outside their homes, chatting in low voices or closing up their small businesses. But tonight, the town felt abandoned, as if it had been swallowed by the darkness. The only sound was the echo of her hurried footsteps, and the ones following her. Her mind raced. Maybe it was just another pedestrian heading home, someone who happened to be walking in the same direction. But deep down, she knew better. There was something off about the way the footsteps mirrored hers exactly. When she walked faster, they did too. When she slowed down, so did they. This was not a coincidence. Her heart pounded wildly as she approached a narrow alleyway. It was a shortcut she often took when she was running late. The alley would cut several minutes off her journey home, but tonight it felt like a trap. The tall brick walls on either side of the alley were covered in shadows, making it impossible to see what lay ahead. She hesitated for just a second before forcing herself to step into the darkness. It's just a shortcut. You've walked this way before. Nothing will happen. The moment she entered the alley, the footsteps behind her stopped. The silence was deafening. The only sound was the rapid beating of her own heart. For a brief moment, she felt foolish. Maybe she had imagined everything. Maybe she had worked too many late nights, and exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. But then, before she could take another breath, the silence shattered. The footsteps suddenly rushed forward, fast, aggressive, and unstoppable. The sound of heavy boots pounding against the pavement sent a shock of terror through her body. Whoever had been following her was no longer trying to stay hidden. They were coming for her. Panic surged through her veins. She spun around, her eyes wide with fear, but the darkness of the alley swallowed everything. She could barely see anything beyond the dim glow of the streetlight at the entrance, but she felt it, the presence, the danger, the raw, unspoken threat hanging in the air. Her body reacted before her mind could catch up. She turned and ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted down the alley, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. She didn't care where she was going. She just needed to get away. The sound of footsteps behind her grew louder, closing the distance between them. "No, no, no!" her mind screamed. "Run faster!" She pushed herself harder, her feet barely touching the ground. She could see the end of the alley now, where the narrow path opened up to another street. If she could just make it there, she might have a chance. But just as she reached the last few steps, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. A figure emerged from the darkness, fast and silent. Before she could react, a strong hand grabbed her from behind. Letherbo barely had time to think before a strong hand clamped over her mouth, cutting off her scream. A masked figure appeared out of nowhere, grabbing her with terrifying force. Her body jerked in shock, her mind struggling to process what was happening. One moment, she was running, desperate to escape, and the next, she was being pulled backward, yanked into the darkness of the alley. Terror exploded inside her. She kicked, thrashed, and clawed at the hand covering her mouth, but the grip only tightened. The attacker's strength was overwhelming. He was bigger, stronger, and completely in control. Letherbo tried to scream again, but it came out as a muffled cry against the rough, gloved hand. Her lungs burned as panic flooded her body. She twisted and fought, refusing to give up. No, I can't let this happen. She reached up, her fingernails scratching at the attacker's face, desperately trying to rip off the mask. He grunted in pain but didn't let go. Instead, he grabbed her wrists and forced them down, crushing them in his powerful grip. Tears burned in her eyes as she realized how helpless she was. Her feet barely touched the ground as he dragged her deeper into the alley, where the streetlights didn't reach. The shadows swallowed them, making her feel like she was sinking into a nightmare. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, drowning out every other sound. The air smelled of damp concrete and decay, a sickening mix that made her stomach churn. The walls of the alley felt like they were closing in, trapping her in this moment of horror. The attacker's breathing was heavy, his grip unyielding. Every part of Lethabo's body screamed in resistance, but the fear gripping her soul was stronger. She thought of her father, his warm smile, the way he used to hold her hand when she was little. If he were still alive, this wouldn't be happening. The thought of him filled her with a new kind of pain, one that burned hotter than fear. He had always protected her, but he was gone now, and no one was coming to save her. She had to save herself. Summoning every ounce of strength left in her, she twisted her body sharply, using the element of surprise. She stomped down on the attacker's foot as hard as she could. He cursed and loosened his grip just enough for her to act. She bit down on his hand with all her might, tasting leather and sweat. The attacker let out a hiss of pain and yanked his hand away. Letherbo gasped for air, her scream finally breaking free into the night. She kicked at him wildly, her nails clawing at his arms, his chest, anywhere she could reach. Her body moved on instinct, driven by pure survival. The attacker stumbled back for a second, clearly not expecting this level of fight from her. She turned and ran, but before she could take more than a few steps, he grabbed her again, this time by her hair. Pain shot through her scalp as he pulled her backward. She cried out, her legs flailing as she tried to regain balance. "Stop fighting," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. But Letherbo wouldn't stop. She refused to let him win. She threw her head back, smashing it into his face with as much force as she could muster. He grunted in pain, his grip loosening for just a second. That second was all she needed. She twisted out of his grasp and ran, her legs moving so fast they felt weightless. Adrenaline surged through her veins, pushing her forward. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she had to get away. Her lungs burned, and her vision blurred with tears, but she didn't stop. Somewhere in the distance, she saw a faint light, a house with its porch light on. Hope ignited in her chest. She sprinted toward it, ignoring the stabbing pain in her side. Behind her, she heard the attacker curse and start after her again. But she was ahead now. She had a chance. With the last of her strength, she reached the door and pounded on it desperately. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" The sound of footsteps grew louder behind her. But then, just as the attacker closed in, the door opened. Letherbo's whole body trembled as she pressed herself against the door, banging on it with all her strength. "Help me! Please! Someone help me!" Her voice was hoarse, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it would burst out of her chest. Behind her, heavy footsteps stopped just a few steps away. She didn't dare turn around. She could feel him standing there, his presence thick and suffocating. The cold night air wrapped around her like a prison, trapping her between the door and the danger lurking behind her. Then she heard it, a voice, low, rough, and far too familiar. Letherbo, her name, whispered softly, but filled with something dark and unsettling. A shiver ran down her spine, and for a moment she couldn't move. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind screamed at her to keep knocking, to keep calling for help, but her body was frozen in terror. She knew that voice. Slowly, hesitantly, she turned her head. The masked man stood just a few feet away, his chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. But now, the mask was gone, and in the dim glow of the streetlight, she saw his face. Her stomach twisted violently. It was him, Tabiso, her stepmother's secret lover. Letherbo felt as though the ground beneath her had vanished. The world around her blurred, and all she could hear was the deafening roar of her heartbeat in her ears. "No," she whispered, shaking her head in disbelief. "It can't be you." But it was him. Thabiso stared at her with cold, dark eyes. The same man who had always visited her home in secret, slipping in when her stepmother thought no one was watching. The man who whispered to Naledi when he thought Lethabo wasn't listening. The man she had never trusted. But why was he here? Why had he attacked her? Her body went numb as realization crept in like poison. This wasn't a random attack. It wasn't some stranger in the night. It was planned. Thabiso had waited for her. He had followed her. And worst of all, someone had sent him. Her blood turned to ice. Naledi. The name crashed into her mind like a thunderstorm. Her stepmother. The woman who had made her life a living nightmare. The woman who had stolen everything from her after her father's death. The woman who had hated her so much that she now wanted her gone. Thabiso took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You weren't supposed to fight," he muttered, almost like he was disappointed. "You were supposed to just disappear." Lethabo's breath hitched. Her worst fear was true. Naledi wanted her dead. Tears welled in her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms. Fear still gripped her, but something else stirred inside her now. Anger. "What did she promise you?" Lethabo's voice was shaky but sharp. "Money? The house? Did she tell you that once I was gone, you two could live happily ever after?" Thabiso didn't answer. His silence was enough. Lethabo's chest tightened with rage. Of course Naledi would do this. She had never wanted her around. She had taken everything from her father's estate, had treated Lethabo like a servant in her own home, had made her suffer every single day. And now, she wanted her erased. But Lethabo wasn't going to let that happen. Slowly, she stepped back, pressing her hand against the door again. If she could just get inside, if she could just find someone to help her. Thabiso sighed, shaking his head. "You always made things difficult," he muttered. "It would have been easier if you had just stayed quiet, just accepted your fate." Lethabo's eyes burned with fury. "I will never stay quiet." Thabiso lunged toward her, but this time, Lethabo was ready. She turned sharply and screamed, not just any scream, a blood-curdling, desperate, earth-shaking scream that tore through the silent night. The door behind her flew open, and suddenly, she wasn't alone anymore. Lethabo's mind spun as she stared at Thabiso, his cruel words still echoing in her ears. Her own stepmother had planned this. The truth felt heavier than anything she had ever carried. As she stood there, fear and anger warring inside her, memories came flooding back, painful memories she had tried so hard to bury. Her father had been her world. He was kind, gentle, and always made her feel safe. Even after her mother had passed away when she was little, her father had done everything to make sure she never felt alone. They had been happy together, but everything changed the day he married Naledi. At first, Naledi pretended to be loving and kind. She smiled in front of Lethabo's father, played the role of a caring stepmother, and spoke sweetly to Lethabo when he was around. But the moment he left the room, her face changed. The warmth in her eyes disappeared, replaced by something cold and hateful. Lethabo had been too young to understand why Naledi despised her. She had done nothing wrong. She had only wanted to be loved. But from the very beginning, Naledi made it clear. Lethabo was not welcome in her own home. It started with small things. Naledi would forget to leave food for Lethabo while she and her daughter Quena ate full meals. She would make Lethabo clean the entire house while Quena played outside. If Lethabo complained, Naledi would remind her that she was lucky to even have a roof over her head. Her father never saw any of it. Naledi was careful, always making sure to play the perfect wife when he was home. But the moment he left for work, the mask came off. The beating started when Lethabo was only 11 years old. If she made a mistake while cleaning, Naledi would slap her. If she didn't move fast enough, she would pull Lethabo's hair or push her so hard that she fell to the floor. Lethabo tried to tell her father once. She had gathered all her courage and whispered to him about how Naledi treated her, but before he could react, Naledi had appeared, smiling sweetly. "Oh, Lethabo," she had laughed. "You must have had a bad dream. You know I love you like my own child." Her father had believed her, or maybe he had wanted to. He had looked tired that day, and Naledi had been so convincing. Lethabo had seen the doubt in his eyes and knew then that she was on her own. When her father got sick, things got even worse. Naledi barely let Lethabo see him, claiming that she didn't want to burden him, but Lethabo knew better. Naledi was keeping them apart on purpose. She didn't want her father to know the truth. And then, one day, he was gone. Just like that. The funeral was a blur. People cried, whispered about how much they would miss him, but all Lethabo could feel was fear. She knew that without her father, there was nothing to protect her from Naledi. She was right. The very night after the funeral, Naledi ripped the blankets off Lethabo's bed and threw her onto the cold floor. "You are nothing," she hissed. "This is my house now, and you will earn your place here." From that day on, Lethabo was no longer treated like family. She was nothing more than a servant. She woke up before dawn to clean, cook, and do the laundry. While Quena wore expensive clothes and went to school with a full lunch, Lethabo was given old, torn dresses and sometimes went to bed without eating. She cried at night, her body aching from exhaustion, wondering why life had turned so cruel. She missed her father so much it hurt. If only he could see what was happening. If only someone could save her. Years passed, and Lethabo learned how to survive. She stopped crying. She stopped begging for Naledi's love. Instead, she worked. She endured. She promised herself that one day she would leave. One day, she would never have to live under Naledi's rule again. But Naledi had different plans. Lethabo had always known that her stepmother was greedy. She loved money more than anything else. But Lethabo had never imagined that Naledi would go so far as to get rid of her, just to take everything her father had left behind. And now, standing in the darkness, facing Thabiso, she realized just how deep Naledi's cruelty ran. It wasn't enough for her to suffer. Naledi wanted her gone. The betrayal cut deeper than anything else. Lethabo clenched her fists, rage burning inside her like fire. She had survived everything Naledi had thrown at her, and she would survive this too. She refused to let Naledi win. Lethabo's breath came in short, sharp gasps as she stared at Thabiso. Her body was still trembling from the attack, but her mind was spinning even faster. She couldn't believe what she had just heard. "What did you just say?" she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. Thabiso sighed, rubbing his jaw where she had hit him earlier. There was no regret in his eyes, no guilt, just frustration, as if she was nothing more than a problem that refused to go away. "You weren't supposed to fight back," he muttered. "It would have been easier if you had just disappeared quietly." Disappeared. The word made Lethabo's blood turn cold. Her stomach twisted violently as realization hit her like a crashing wave. This wasn't a random attack. Thabiso hadn't been some stranger lurking in the darkness, looking for a victim. This was planned. This was personal. Lethabo took a shaky step back, shaking her head. No, that can't be true. But deep down, she knew it was true. She had always known that Naledi hated her. She had always known that her stepmother wanted her gone. But she had never imagined Naledi would go this far. Thabiso smirked bitterly. "You think this is a coincidence?" he asked, his voice laced with mockery. "You think I just happened to be here, waiting in the dark, knowing exactly what time you'd be walking home?" He shook his head. "Your stepmother planned this. She wanted you gone. She made sure I got the job done." Lethabo felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. Naledi had sent him. Naledi had planned this. She wanted Lethabo to vanish. The world around her blurred, her thoughts racing back to every cruel thing Naledi had ever done to her. The beatings, the starvation, the way she had made Lethabo feel worthless, unwanted. And now she had taken it one step further. Lethabo's hands curled into fists, nails digging into her palms. "Why?" she demanded, her voice shaking with fury. "Why does she want me gone so badly? What did I ever do to her?" Thabiso let out a dry laugh, as if he found her question amusing. "It's not about what you did. It's about what you have." Lethabo frowned, confused. Thabiso sighed, as if he were tired of explaining. "Your father left you something, didn't he? Money? The house?" His eyes darkened. "Naledi doesn't want you to have any of it. She wants it all for herself, and as long as you're alive, you're in her way." Lethabo's body went stiff. The inheritance. Her father's house. That was what this was about. Naledi wasn't just cruel. She was greedy. She had spent years treating Lethabo like a burden, and now she wanted to erase her completely, all for wealth and power. Lethabo clenched her jaw. "So you agreed to kill me? Just like that?" Thabiso gave her a long look before shrugging. "It's not personal," he said simply. "Your stepmother offered a good deal, and I take care of my own interests." Lethabo wanted to scream. He spoke about her life like it was nothing, like she was just another problem to get rid of. She thought of all the nights she had gone to bed hungry, while Naledi and Quena ate like queens. She thought of all the times she had scrubbed the floors until her fingers bled while Quena got everything handed to her on a silver platter. She thought of the times she had wished, prayed for her father to come back and save her, but he wasn't here. No one was coming to save her. She had to save herself. Lethabo took a deep breath, forcing herself to stay calm. She had escaped Thabiso's grip once. She could do it again. But this time, she wouldn't just run. She would fight back. She straightened her spine, staring him down. "You think you can just make me disappear?" she asked, her voice steadier now. Thabiso smirked. "I don't think, Lethabo. I know." Lethabo took a slow step back, her mind racing. She needed to get away from him, fast. But she also needed to stop him. If she ran, what if he followed? What if he finished the job Naledi had given him? Her eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use. A broken bottle, a rock, anything. Thabiso sighed, as if he were tired of playing games. "Look, just accept it," he said, stepping toward her. "You were never supposed to survive this long. Your mother died. Your father died. Now, it's your turn." Rage exploded inside Lethabo. She lunged forward before he could react, swinging her fist with all the strength she had. Her knuckles connected with his jaw, making him stumble back with a curse. She didn't wait. She grabbed a loose brick from the ground and threw it at him. It hit his shoulder, making him yell in pain. Then she turned and ran. Her legs burned, but she pushed forward, forcing herself to go faster. The night air stung her face as she sprinted down the street. She could hear Thabiso cursing behind her, his footsteps pounding against the pavement. But she refused to stop. Up ahead, she saw a house with lights on. A chance. A hope. She reached the door and banged on it desperately. "Help me! Please! Someone help me!" A noise behind her. She turned, just in time to see Thabiso lunging at her again. But before he could reach her, the door flew open. Lethabo's heart pounded like a drum inside her chest. Her breath came in short, painful gasps as she struggled against Thabiso's grip. His fingers dug into her arm, trying to pull her back into the shadows. But she refused to let him win. She twisted her body, kicking wildly, her knee slamming into his stomach. He grunted in pain but didn't let go. Desperation took over. Lethabo scratched at his face, her nails digging into his skin. He cursed loudly, momentarily loosening his grip. That was all she needed. She bit down hard on his hand, tasting blood as he yanked it away with a howl of pain. "You little," Thabiso started, but before he could finish, Lethabo spun around and delivered a sharp elbow to his ribs. He staggered back, his face twisted in rage. Lethabo didn't wait to see what he would do next. She turned and ran. Her legs burned as she sprinted down the dark street, her bare feet slapping against the cold pavement. She didn't care about the pain. She didn't care that she could barely breathe. All that mattered was getting away. Behind her, she heard Thabiso cursing and the sound of his footsteps chasing after her. He was fast, too fast. Panic shot through her like lightning. She needed to find help. Now up ahead, she spotted a house with its lights still on. It was her only chance. Her legs felt like they would give out, but she pushed forward, forcing herself to run faster. As she reached the door, she banged on it with all her strength. "Help me! Please! Someone help me!" Her voice was raw, filled with terror. She glanced over her shoulder. Thabiso was getting closer, his face twisted with fury. "Open the door! Please!" she screamed again, slamming her fists against the wood. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. No one answered. Then, just as Thabiso lunged forward to grab her, the door flew open. The door swung open just in time. A middle-aged man stood there, his eyes widening in shock as he saw Lethabo's terrified face. Without thinking, she threw herself inside, gasping for breath. "He's trying to kill me!" she cried, pointing at Thabiso, who had stopped just outside the door. The man didn't hesitate. He grabbed a wooden stick from behind the door and stepped forward, blocking Thabiso's path. "Get away from my house!" he shouted. Thabiso's face twisted with frustration. He looked between Lethabo and the man, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it seemed like he was about to attack again. But then, the sound of sirens filled the air. Blue and red lights flashed in the distance, getting closer and closer. Someone had called the police. Thabiso's eyes widened in panic. He turned on his heel and tried to run, but it was too late. A police car screeched to a stop, and officers jumped out, their guns drawn. "Stop right there," one of them commanded. Thabiso hesitated for only a second before bolting toward the alley, but he didn't get far. The officers tackled him to the ground, pinning his arms behind his back as he struggled. Lethabo watched as they handcuffed him, her heart still racing. She could hardly believe it. It was over. He was caught. One of the officers turned to her. "Are you hurt?" he asked gently. Lethabo's voice trembled as she spoke. I don't know. He tried to kill me." The officer nodded, his expression serious. "You're safe now. We're going to take your statement. Don't worry. We'll make sure he pays for what he's done." But Thabiso wasn't the only one who needed to pay. As the police investigated further, shocking truths began to unfold. Thabiso, desperate to save himself, revealed everything. He told the police how Naledi had hired him to get rid of Lethabo, how she had promised him money, saying that Lethabo was nothing but an obstacle in her life. The police dug deeper into Naledi's past, and what they found was even worse. Not only had she planned the attack, but she had also stolen money from Lethabo's late father. She had forged documents, emptied bank accounts, and transferred everything into her own name. She had been living off stolen wealth while Lethabo suffered. When the police showed up at her house, Naledi tried to lie her way out of it. She cried, acted innocent, and pretended to be shocked, but the evidence was clear. Thabiso's confession, the stolen money, the forged documents, everything pointed to her guilt. She was arrested on the spot. Lethabo stood outside the police station as Naledi was led away in handcuffs. Their eyes met for a brief moment. Naledi's face was filled with fear and anger, but there was something else there too: defeat. For the first time, Lethabo saw her stepmother powerless, and for the first time in years, Lethabo felt free. For the first time in her life, Lethabo could finally breathe. The weight that had been crushing her for years was gone. Naledi was behind bars, facing serious charges, and Thabiso would never be able to hurt her again. Justice had been served, but even though her enemies had fallen, she knew that her journey was not over. She stood outside the police station, feeling the cool night breeze against her skin. The stars above seemed brighter than before, as if the universe itself was telling her that a new chapter had begun. She had survived, she had fought back, and now it was time to rebuild her life. With the little money she had saved from working at the restaurant, Lethabo made a decision. She would leave Zubayn behind. There were too many painful memories in this town, too many dark corners filled with shadows of her past. She needed a fresh start. She packed her few belongings into a small bag and took a bus to a new town. It wasn't a big city, but it was different. It was a place where no one knew her, where she could walk the streets without fear of seeing Naledi's cruel eyes or hearing Thabiso's sinister voice. It was a place where she could become someone new. At first, things were difficult. She had no family, no friends, and no home. She stayed in a small, cheap room, using her savings carefully. She found a job at another restaurant, working long hours just to survive. But she didn't complain. Every plate she washed, every table she cleaned, it was all worth it because she was free. But freedom wasn't enough. Lethabo wanted more than just survival. She wanted purpose. One evening, after work, she sat alone in her tiny room, scrolling through her phone. She came across a story about a young girl who had run away from home to escape abuse. The girl had been rescued by a women's shelter, a place that helped victims of violence and neglect. Lethabo's heart ached as she read the story. She thought about all the nights she had cried herself to sleep, wishing someone would save her. She thought about the pain of being treated like she was nothing, and she knew there were many other girls, just like her. Girls who were trapped in homes filled with cruelty, too scared to speak, too scared to run. That night, Lethabo made a promise to herself. She would not just rebuild her own life, she would help others do the same. She started by volunteering at a local shelter, listening to the stories of girls who had suffered just like she had. Some had been abused by family members, some had been betrayed by people they trusted. Lethabo understood their pain better than anyone. She shared her own story, telling them how she had survived, how she had fought back, and how she had escaped. She told them that they were not alone, that they were stronger than they knew. Slowly, her words began to inspire others. Girls who had once been silent started to speak. They started to believe that they, too, could break free. As the months passed, Lethabo's work at the shelter became more than just a volunteer job. It became her passion. She helped girls find jobs, guided them through legal processes, and stood by their side when they needed support. She had once been a victim, but now she was a warrior. One day, as she walked through the shelter, a young girl approached her. She had bruises on her arms and fear in her eyes. "How did you do it?" the girl whispered. "How did you escape?" Lethabo smiled gently and took the girl's hand. "By believing that I deserved better," she said, and by fighting until I was free. And in that moment, she knew her past had not broken her. It had made her. It had turned her into a voice for those who had none. Lethabo had started a new life, not just for herself, but for every girl who had ever been trapped in the darkness. And this time, she was determined. She would never be a victim again.